Hi, everybody. Sorry it's taking me this long to get this out here, but I'm hoping that you'll be able to read this or listen to it before we start today. Okay, so this is chapter 12, and I'm going to go all the way to 14. I'm hoping that you would have read it, but I'm going to read it here. I don't have the best voice like the guy that we're listening to, but I'm looking forward to reading some tomorrow. Okay, chapter 12, Adieu. The sound of the drum changed again, and the final tat disappeared, and it became nothing but boom, 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 boom. Lester used only his tail, bringing it down with great force and seriousness upon the drum. The threadmaster retreated. The room full of mice fell silent, expectant, waiting. And as Despereaux stood before them, with the red thread around his neck, the 14 members of the Mouse Council perched on the bricks above him. 2 burly mice came forward. Black pieces of cloth covered their heads. There were slits for their eyes. "We," said the bigger of the 2 mice, "will escort you to the dungeon." "Despereaux," Antoinette called out. "Ah, my Despereaux!" Despereaux looked out into the crowd of mice and saw his mother. She was easy to spot. In honor of her youngest mouse being sent to the dungeon, she had put on a tremendous amount of makeup. Each of the hooded mice put a paw on Despereaux's shoulder. "It's time," said one on the left, the first hood. Antoinette pushed her way through the crowd. "He is my son," she said. "I want to have a last word with my son." Despereaux looked at his mother. He concentrated on standing before her without trembling. He concentrated on not being disappointment. "Please," said Antoinette, "what will happen to him? What will happen to my baby?" "Ma'am," the first hood. His voice was deep and slow. "You don't want to know." I want to know. He is my child, the child of my heart, the last of my mice babies." The hooded mice said nothing. "Tell me," said Antoinette. "The rats," said the first. "The rats," said the second. Yes, oh, the rats, what of them?" "The rats will eat him," said the second hood. "Ah," said Antoinette, "Mon Dieu." Oops, let me move myself. Okay. At the thought of being eaten by rats, Despereaux forgot about being brave. He forgot about not being disappointment, and he felt himself heading for another faint. But his mother, who had an excellent sense of dramatic timing, beat him to it. She executed a beautiful, flawless swoon, landing right at Despereaux's feet. "Now you've done it," said the first hood. "It doesn't matter," said the second. "Step over her. We have a job to do. Nobody's mother is going to stop us. To the dungeon." "To the dungeon," repeated the first hood, but his voice was deep and certain a moment ago, now shook a tiny bit. He put a paw on Despereaux and tugged him forward, and the 2 hoods of Despereaux stepped over Antoinette. The crowd parted. The mice began to chant, "To the dungeon, to the dungeon, to the dungeon." The drumbeat continued, boom, 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 boom. And Despereaux was led away. At that last moment, Antoinette came out of her faint and shouted out a word to her child. That word, reader, was adieu. Do you know the definition of adieu? Don't bother with your dictionary. I will tell you. Adieu is the French word for farewell. Farewell is not the word that you would like to hear from your mother as you are being led to the dungeon by an oversized mice in black hoods. Words you wouldn't like to hear. Words you would like to hear is, "Take me instead. I will go to the dungeon in my son's place." There is a great deal of comfort for those words. But, reader, there is no comfort in farewell, even if you say it in French. Farewell is a word that any language is full of sorrow. It is a word that promises absolutely nothing. Excuse me. Chapter 13, Perfidy Unlimited. Together, the 3 mice traveled down, down, down. The thread around Despereaux's neck was tight. I'm sorry. He felt as if It was choking him. He tugged on at it with one paw. "Don't touch the thread," barked the second hood. "Yeah," echoed the first hood. "Don't touch the thread." They moved quickly, and whenever Despereaux slowed, one of the two hoods poked him in the shoulder and told him to keep moving. They went through the holes in the walls, down the golden stairs. They went past the rooms wide, and the three mice traveled across the marble floors and under the heavy velvet drapes. They moved through the warm patches of sunlight and dark pools of shade. This, thought Despereaux, was the world he was leaving behind, the world that he knew and loved, and somewhere in it the Princess P was laughing and smiling and clapping her hands to the music, unaware of Despereaux's fate, and he would not be able to let the princess know what had become of him seemed suddenly unbearable to a mouse. "Would it be possible for me to have one last word with the princess?" Despereaux asked. "A word?" said the second hood. "You want a word with a human?" "I want to tell her what has happened to me." "Geez," said the first hood. He stopped and stamped a paw at the floor in frustration. "Cripes! You can't learn, can you?" The voice was terribly familiar to Despereaux. "Furlough?" he said. "What?" said the first hood irritably. Despereaux shuddered. His own brother was delivering him to the dungeon? His heart stopped beating and shrunk to a small, cold, disbelieving pebble. But then, just as quickly, it leapt alive again, beating with hope. "Furlough," Despereaux said, as he took one of the brother's paws in his own. "Please let me go. Please. I'm your brother." Furlough rolled his eyes. He took his paw out of Despereaux's. "No," he said. "No way." "Please," said Despereaux. "No. Rules are rules." Reader, do you recall the word perfidy? As our story progresses, perfidy becomes an ever more appropriate word, doesn't it? Perfidy was certainly the word that was Despereaux's mind. As the mice finally approached the narrow, steep stairs and led to the black hole of the dungeon, they stood, the three mice, two with hoods and one without, contemplated the abyss before them, and then Furlough stood up on his hind legs and placed a paw over his heart. "For the good of the castle mice," he announced in the darkness, "we deliver this day to the dungeon a mouse in need of punishment. He is, according to the laws we have established, wearing the red thread of death." And there's a picture of Despereaux. Poor baby. "The red thread of death," repeated Despereaux in a small voice. Wearing the red thread of death was a terrible phrase, but the mouse didn't have long to consider its implications, because he was suddenly pushed from behind into a hood by the hooded mice. The push was a strong one, and it sent Despereaux flying down the stairs into the dungeon. As he tumbled whisker over tail through the darkness, there was only two words of his mind. One was perfidy, and the other word was that he clung to was P. Perfidy, P. Perfidy, P. These were the words that pinwheeled through Despereaux's mind as his body descended into the darkness. Chapter 14. Despereaux lay on his back at the bottom of the steps and touched the bones of his body one by one. They were all there, and amazingly they were unbroken. He got to his feet and became aware of the terrible, foul, extremely insulting smell. The dungeon reader stank. It stank of despair and suffering and hopelessness, which is to say that the dungeon smelled of rats. And it was so dark, Despereaux had never before encountered darkness so awful, so all-encompassing. The darkness had a physical presence, as if it were a being all on its own. The mouse held out one paw up in front of his whiskers. He could not see it, and it was truly alarming thought that perhaps he, Despereaux Tilling, did not even exist. Oh my, he said out loud. His voice echoed in the smelly darkness. Perfidy, said Despereaux. Just to hear his voice again, just to assure himself that he did exist. P, said Despereaux, and the name of his beloved was immediately swallowed by the darkness. He shivered and shook and sneezed. His teeth chattered, and he longed for his handkerchief. He grabbed hold of his tail. It took him a long, frightening moment to even locate his tail, so absolute was the darkness, to have something, anything to hold on to. He considered fainting. He deemed it the only reasonable response to the situation in which he had found himself. But then he remembered the words of the threadmaster: honor, courtesy, devotion, and bravery. I will be brave, thought Despereaux. I will try to be brave like the knight in the shining armor. I will be brave for the Princess P. How best for him to be brave? He cleared his throat. He let go of his tail and stood up straighter. Once upon a time, he said out loud to the darkness. He said these words because they were the best and the most powerful words that he knew, and just the saying of them comforted him. Once upon a time, he said again, feeling the tiny bit braver, there was a knight, and he wore always an armor of shining silver. Once upon a time, boomed the voice in the darkness, a knight in shining armor. What does a mouse know of such things? The voice, the loudest voice that Despereaux had ever heard, could only be assumed before to the world's largest rat. Despereaux's small, overworked heart stopped beating, and for a second time that day the mouse fainted. So we'll start chapter 15 today in class. Anyway, I will see you. I hope you guys have time, and I'm sorry it took me so long to get this out here, but that mother, Antoinette, my goodness. So I'll see you later. Bye.